So I started to dip my toes into CNC almost a year ago, and feeling utterly lost, I reached out to fellow maker Winston Moy. The following is a chronicle of our shared descent into madness. And at some point I build a Rapidstrike. The flywheel cage is the most important part of this type of blaster. All of your velocity and accuracy, and even the sound it makes, all depends on how you've designed your cage. I've been working on my design for years, so Winston decided to machine two of them, one for me and one for him, and in exchange, I would build him a Rapidstrike. Now, of course, both of our projects went horribly wrong, but we'll get to that later. To start off, the first thing I knew I needed to do was design a full body kit. That might seem a little dramatic, but the stock Rapidstrike, it doesn't deserve the work we're going to put into it, so it needed an overhaul. I'm going to be real with you, I don't remember how many pieces I designed for this kit. It was a lot. So let's just hit the two main players. To start with, we need a flat top. The handle is nice, but it's not exactly aggressive. The goal here is to make your bodywork invisible. You can hide joints with panel lines, but I wanted this as smooth as possible, which means triple checking your measurements and sometimes making multiple iterations. In order to blend your design into the shell, you have to make it split in half. Look at the blaster's technical design and carry it through your own parts. How can you make your work flow both inside and out? How can you make it into one new thing rather than two things stuck together? You can even model some of the blaster you're modifying to make sure that everything lines up right, and you'll even get some practice seeing how they design things. Designing the motor covers was a lot less easy. Problem number one was that I needed a lot more room for the motors, and I wanted to keep it symmetrical, which means any room I added, I'd have to add to the other side too. Trying to integrate a bulbous protrusion onto the side of something that's already sleek and aggressive is not exactly easy. And on top of that, the shape I was making is very easy to get very wrong. Lastly, the whole point of this part was to show off Winston's amazing CNC work, which means that a large portion of it had to be completely clear. This effectively limited me to using only flat sheet material for those covers. I felt so backed into a corner with this part that I ended up remaking it probably 5 or 6 times. There's nothing wrong with redesigning a part. The problem is it can get very discouraging. It can also be helpful to put some distance between you and your design. I ended up designing 2 or 3 more and then going back to an older version because I ended up liking it the most. After that, I knocked out a few more parts using the same method and called it done. With everything designed and printed, it was easy from there. It was just, sanding. Forever. There are a lot of different ways to cut through plastic, but personally, I prefer roughing out with a handsaw and then following up with a pair of flush cutters. I'll usually come back with a couple different files just to smooth off the surface. You can, of course, use something like a Dremel, but the rougher your edge is, the more time you have to spend finishing it. Integrating your new parts on is pretty much the same story. There's a million different ways to do it. My preferred method is to use cyanoacrylate or CA glue, which is effectively a more potent super glue. I generally prefer the medium or the thick, but I also keep the thin stuff around. Start by doing a dry fit to make sure everything lines up right. Once you're happy that everything's lined up nicely, then run a bead of glue along all of your contacting surfaces. Lower your part down slowly. With medium CA glue, you've got about 5 seconds to correct any errors, and with thick, you've got about 10 or 15. Try to get it as precise as possible, because after that point, you're just going to have to sand out any problem areas. It's probably worth mentioning that I always glue the two halves separately to avoid accidentally gluing the two shell halves together. A simple superglue joint is not going to be strong enough to keep these two parts together. Think of this part as a tack weld. If you want any real strength, you have to follow it up with gap filling. Run some glue along the joint, making sure it totally covers the seam line. You want a little extra material so you can sand it back and make sure the connection is perfectly flush. From there, you just keep adding parts and checking that everything still fits. If there are any blemishes on the surface, like 3D print lines or deep scratches, this is where your thin CA glue comes in. Flood some gently over the surface and just let it cure in the air. Once it's done, just come back and sand the surface flush again. Don't panic. The first coat of primer always shows you mistakes. It's honestly just part of the sanding process. Wait for it to cure a little bit and then sand back the problem areas. You might have to try a few times, and that's totally normal. I think what you're seeing here is my third skim coat. Once you're happy with it, you can start laying down thicker coats. The base coat was easy, just paint. Since there's windows in the side of the blaster, I painted the inside black as well. Next is masking. Masking is a huge topic all on its own, and we don't have time for it in this video. If you want to look into that sort of thing, I definitely recommend checking out people like Adam Savage and Bill Duran. The most important piece of advice I could give you with all my years of masking is make sure the edge is pressed down hard. Fixing paint bleed is possible, but it's difficult and tedious and not worth it. I was lucky enough to not have that problem on this build. Other problems, though. Yeah, I had those. Do you remember when I said that this project went horribly wrong at some point? Well, the night before I was supposed to leave to bring Winston this blaster, I was applying the final coat of paint. Okay, I left it to the last minute. Busted. You see, Winston had decided on a color of paint that was easily available from the hardware store. So I took a shortcut and I bought the cheap touch-up can. At this point, I have to apologize because I stopped filming. What you're seeing right now is the final product with clear coat on. It's hard to look at, I know. I did a little bit of math and realized that my clear coat had to go on in the next 2 hours, or else this project was scrapped. The paint did something called orange peeling. That's where, as it cures, it crinkles up and forms little ridges and valleys. The correct thing to do, given my time constraints, would have been to wait as long as possible and then knock down all the high spots with some steel wool. I was, however, having an honest-to-goodness panic attack, and it doesn't take a genius to guess that that's not what I did. I thought it was cured, so I hit it with some light sandpaper. That ripped up not only the top layer of paint, but also the layer of undercoat and even some of the primer as well. At that point, if I wanted a perfect result like I planned, I only had 2 options: sand the paint back completely, or throw the entire thing out and start over again. That wasn't exactly happening in the 2 hours I had left. So I sucked up my perfectionism and dusted it with paint every 5 minutes for about an hour. I applied Winston's logo with a vinyl cutter and tried to keep my hand steady enough for a decent signature. Then it was just mixing up some thick gloss 2K and applying it thick enough to distract from the orange peel. Failure like that can be really hard to talk about. So as a reward for sticking through, here's some sweet slow-mo footage of me peeling some tape off. We made it. Now we're in San Jose, with no tools or equipment, and missing a few parts. Luckily, not everybody had left home yet, so I put out an emergency message and Nathan came through with all the parts I needed. As for tools, we bought some and improvised a few. In a room full of brilliant makers, this rewire took no time at all. Oh, yeah, and we got it done just in time for, golden hour. This project went on for so long that it feels weird ending it. So much went on both our ends that didn't make it into our videos. It really kills me because there's so much more that I could share, but this video would be 2 parts or half an hour long, and that's absolutely not an exaggeration. This project started with Winston and I both saying, hey, you make cool things, let's make a cool thing together. But along the way, we discovered exactly how well we work together. I guess the real Nerf blaster was the friendship we made along the way. Both of our parts had flaws, and in some ways they kinda matched. As it turned out, Winston ended up liking the crackling in the paint job. It does kinda look like hammered metal, which is a perfect scapegoat for me. But I had always intended on putting nicer electronics in it, and I just didn't get the time. In all honesty, the blaster never actually got finished. I still have some parts here that I need to install, not to mention my cage needs a home. So, what do you say, Winston? Part 2? If you've made it this far, you absolutely have to go watch Winston's side of the story. And if for some ungodly reason you're not already subscribed to him, you need to do that. I generally prefer the medium or the thick.